Welcome to the Death and Resurrection Doula podcast. I'm your host, Laurel Nicholson, a Christian end-of-life doula and theologian. Here we create space for hope-filled conversations about the realities of dying and the eternal life promised to us through Jesus Christ. Please note that some topics we discuss surrounding end-of-life experiences and related subjects may be sensitive for certain audience members. Listener discretion is kindly advised. In each episode, we invite you to explore what it means to live and die in the light of the resurrection, and how this hope shapes the way we approach end-of-life care in the many fields connected to this ministry. So brew a cup of tea or coffee if you prefer. Settle in and join our fellowship as we find peace in knowing that through Christ, death itself is transformed into a glorious new life. Hello, I'm Laurel Nicholson. I'm the creator and director of the Death and Resurrection Doula Training Program. I also have a weekly fellowship opportunity online. It's called the International Fellowship Cafe. Today, I have a special guest, and I met her as she first came to the International Fellowship Cafe. And she's also signed up for the volunteer training program, which is exciting. I love nurses who are still wanting to be in the field of care. They're maybe retired or thinking about retirement, and they're looking at how they can stay current with people who are in need of such gracious care. I'm going to read your bio, Georgia, and then I would love it if you would fill in a little bit more about what you're doing. And I have some great questions for you too. This is Georgia Welnick, and she's a retired registered nurse with over 30 years of practice. And when she was working as a nurse, she accumulated a wide range of experiences and skills in pediatrics, adult medical surgical care, public health, functional medicine, hospice, and home care. She loves everything that she's done, but her favorite role at the peak of her career was in clinical research. You were an RN research coordinator in pediatric research for the University of South Carolina and the Medical University of South Carolina. You spent time working for Prisma Health in critical care clinical research. And more recently, you have been working for a small hospice company. You retired in 2025. You are continuing to provide support to individuals who are in hospice care in the volunteer role. I have another podcast about hospice and doula collaboration. Clinical trials was a big part of what made his choices difficult. And so this was interesting to you. And you also have chronic leukemia, which you've been open about with me and said it was okay for me to share that. We are going to learn so much from you today, Georgia, and I really appreciate you coming to talk to me. I want to begin by giving you some time to share more about yourself.
When I started in clinical research, I was a homeschool mom, and one of my children wanted to go back to school. So we were sending them to private school, and we're thinking, how are we going to finagle all this? I ended up living very close to the University of South Carolina. They have a medical school. There was a position for a part-time clinical research nurse to work in pediatrics. And I worked in pediatric endocrinology predominantly at that point. And so you think of endocrinology for pediatrics, you have a lot of diabetic children, but I actually worked with various studies and I fell in love with it. And then I went to Prisma Health System and worked in a critical care team. And so that was more a lot of stroke studies. We did cardiac studies. Sepsis was very, very interesting. So sepsis is, where the bloodstream gets infected and you can surmise to death pretty quickly. So it was a new drug that we were giving to hopefully early on in sepsis to stop that process. And then that's just one study. I did several studies. And then the pediatric department at the University of South Carolina Pediatrics asked me to come back. I worked with them to help them from their coordinator left and they were losing momentum and possibly having some of the studies shut down because, you're audited all the time. So I went in there to try to help them fix their books and all that. So really with the pediatric studies, I was not really in the life or death situations. But yet, I think as a coordinator, sometimes you find yourself in situations that you never ever have nothing to do with the study. Nothing. hardly anything to do with the study. But when somebody comes into a clinical trial, one of the benefits, I think one of the biggest benefits, is that you have you're really being watched closely by a team of people. So if anything changes that we're collecting data or lab data or EKG, whatever we're doing a lot of it. And if anything changes for the better or the worst, we're apt to catch it because we have all these eyes on it. And because with research, everything has to be, you cross your T's and dot your I's. So I found myself in a role of really much more than just a coordinator. For example, we had a child on a study that his parents were missionaries. Yeah, I believe it was the Caribbean. I don't remember exactly what condition he had, but we wanted him to finish out the study. And that meant he had, for one of the visits, he had to at least come home. And the parents couldn't afford to have him come home. Well, the principal investigator, or the physician that was over me and oversaw the study at our site, he went to the University of South Carolina, and it just so happened like the president of United or one of the airlines was a USC grad, and they were able to get that paid for him to fly home. That has nothing to do, that's outside of the realm. So you build these relationships with people that is outside of the realm. And plus, she was an amazing believer, his mother. And so I was blessed to build a lot of relationships with people over time because, they're dealing with children with chronic conditions. And then with adults, probably the one thing that really sticks out in my mind, I'm going to say the positive. There's a lot that doesn't work out, especially with stroke trials, and you're getting them in that real acute phase of stroke, and they might not make it, or they might not get better. I mean, that happens. But again, you just have this extra group of people that are trying to care for you if you choose to be in the study. And that can be a real intimate relationship because we can be more focused on an individual in their case. So I had one man, he came in and he was septic. And what I would do is kind of work behind. I'd come in every day with my team and I'm scanning all the computers in the hospital to look for septic patients because, again, this drug was given early on. So we had a long formula that we had to use to determine whether or not a patient was in the early phases of sepsis. And if they were, they'd be eligible. Well, he could not consent for himself. So it had to be his sister. And she had to come to the hospital to sign. And we had like a 12-hour window. She couldn't find her keys. It was just these kind of stories you get. She's in another town. She's about an hour away. And she's got to sign this document. And we got to get this drug on board before the 12-hour mark. And in his case, we almost didn't make it. And that's a real issue because then you're getting out of the parameters of the study. Now, we did make it, but I'm talking by the seat of the pants. And this guy got better quickly. It was unbelievable. But the thing, out of all of the things, that his life was saved, and he was grateful for that. He was an indigent person, so he didn't have good access to care, and he felt like the sepsis was that he had mold in his house. And so he's calling me. We're talking on the phone. I'm following up on the study. How you doing? Whatever I was doing at that study. And the main point of our conversation turns out to be, how is he going to be able to get mold out of his house, black mold? And how am I going to, he said, so we took care of that. And he said, I want to quit smoking. I think I want to quit smoking. And he didn't have any way to get, we're trying to get him help patches and things like that. And I'm doing totally outside of my realm of care as a clinical trial, but I'm trying to get him to be able to see a physician. You had to get a prescription. And how are we going to do this? Research is a lot more than just you're the guinea pig, you're the subject, because they are subjects. We call them subjects. They're given a number. But on that one-to-one level, you're way, 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 way more than that. not everybody, but if time allows. And he made it. Now that is not the case. In fact, that drug didn't make it to market, which is very interesting. So I don't know if it was just God's time. It didn't make it to market because it didn't meet whatever
Mhm.
criteria. And I always think of that, but something worked. Something changed him. It was quite amazing.
Let me
So
pause you
that's
for a
my
second.
background in
I
research.
I wanna go back to the story for a minute with the pediatric patient and his mother, and I mean, so far what I'm hearing in summary is we're getting insight into clinical trials that likely as outsiders we don't have, right? We're like, "Oh, a trial." I saw a little bit of it as a doula, working for a man with colon cancer, and there were some difficulties, and if there's time, I'll recap on that a little bit, but I'm thinking of the necessity of the exterior forces, such as the United Pilot, right? And the connection to University of South Carolina, and these external things that made something happen that was not by chance, right? And then I think of the mother being a Christian and praying, and so you can just imagine in the Bahamas or Caribbean, I can't remember exactly where you said she was, but she was praying that the Lord would work this out. I imagine that she was. And the things just to hear, you know, there's a more conversation today about medicine and science. And, can we believe in science if we believe in God? Does God use science? This is becoming a topic again that people are researching and reading about, and it seems to me in just a little bit of the story you've told that yes, God worked through the prayers of this mother for her son and brought these forces together that would have been impossible for humans.
That particular boy, the first time, the first time I saw him and I drew blood, I had an error I had to redraw the blood. And I told my boss, well, I'll go to him. I'll go drive out and it was about an hour drive. I'll go to him and I don't want this to be inconvenient for them. And that's where we first started talking about her being a missionary and a missionary, her and her husband. I think they were pastoring at that time, and then they went back out in the field. But when she would come to the office, and because he was already developing, he was preteen, and the physician had to do a thorough exam. And out of respect, because he was a young man, especially in the eyes of the physician asked her to step outside the room, and she would stand outside the room and sing praise. She had a beautiful voice. I think she might have played or did that in church. And the physician, who he was really into music because he sang in a quartet, and I never saw a person so drawn to that. It was almost like King David, like Saul and David. And I will never forget that because it just totally changed his demeanor. He could be a tough guy to work with, but he was a wonderful physician.
Mhm.
But my point is, God works, going along with what you say, in ways that we never can put in a box, ever. Sometimes their faith just pours out of them like gold, and people around them. I had another woman in hospice. This is a switch, that was a believer in her. She had twins, adult. She was in hospice and she was elderly, and her her daughters were older than I was, I think. And I happened to be with her when she passed, but before she passed, and it was kind of one of those things that we thought, why is this taking so long? She was ready to go. Her daughters were ready. They loved the Lord. They were with her all the time. She was in a facility. And I remember walking in and I actually got down on my knees and started praying. That doesn't happen very often. But that room was filled with so much of the glory of God. I mean, these young nurses and aides would come into her room even when she was dying just to hang out there. It was just surreal. So yeah, God works in all. He's not shut out of the hospital system by any chance, or clinical trials or anything.
That excites me and encourages me. I was visiting with someone today who's in hospice care. And, I just happened to show up when the hospice nurse was there and I hadn't met her yet. He's new to hospice. And I told her, no rush, I'll sit here and wait. And she's like, no, you guys can start your visit. I'm just wrapping up. And so I said to the man, I brought this book back, Heaven. And we had read a little bit of it a couple times ago when I visited. And I just felt like bringing it back today. And anyway, she saw the book and she said, oh, I'm a Christian too. And so it got us to talking about the Lord. And she shared the story that has just happened recently in her family. It seemed like a miracle. Her father was going in for a procedure and they had, seen something on scans. And sure enough, they scanned him again and it wasn't there. And the doctor said, I don't know what to tell you. Right. So for sure, God is in medicine. And, it's interesting because this man in hospice I'm talking about, it's been a long journey with him. I've actually visited him on and off for over a year. He was in hospice and then lost his eligibility. And then he's back on hospice with a new hospice agency. He's really suffered. We pray and I know he has a team praying for him. It sometimes feels sort of like God's absent and it's Job, or the desert for
Yeah.
him. And then there's a story of healing. It is not easy as a Christian physician, nurse, doula to be able to explain to anyone why over a year of praying
Right.
doesn't yield tangible change, but yet we also see these dynamic things that the Lord is doing. So I think with, a man such as that it's not that the Lord hasn't done anything, that he's probably done a lot more than we fully understand, but the drag of suffering can be
It can be.
hard and long. But I find this encouraging because thinking as a doula, my job is to prepare people emotionally and spiritually that their end is nearing. When I spoke about another man that I worked for, and he delayed beginning hospice as long as possible. And one of the ways he delayed that was to do a clinical trial. He was a believer. Do we take a clinical trial in hopes that just giving God a little bit longer is all that we need is going into hospice care, signing off as in I don't believe anymore, Lord, that you will heal me. I think people probably deep down struggle with
That's a
questions like
great
that.
point. That is a very good point. We talk about these kind of dilemmas all the time, and it's very complicated. And the research can be complicated too, because at that point, when we're talking about, and I did not work with like stage 4 cancer patients. I did not do that. However, as part of my certification, I went to several conferences and I listened to a physician who I believe was in the Charlotte area, but all his patients, they are at the end of the rope. And to get funding for people at the end of the rope is so difficult, number one. And number
Right.
two, the point of the trial, it truly is experimental. Like we don't even know if this is going to be safe in humans, that phase 1. Those are very hard trials to even do. He did talk about what the staff goes through in caring for where almost all your patients, just like a doula, pass away. But yet we that hope, hope is definitely and for everybody. I mean, you have to have hope. Otherwise, you wouldn't even go through the hardship of running a phase 4 freestanding clinical trial where patients come when they're at the end of their rope. I think a lot of individuals really, a big part of what drives them at that point is they want to do something for society. And this is what they can do for whatever reason, if they're motivated by works, as we would say, or love
Sure.
language, or if this will make it better down the road for somebody else, I'm willing to do this because I'm going to die anyway. I guess they wouldn't qualify for hospice if they were in that, but still, it seems like it would be a very difficult niche, but a niche for a doula as well.
That was my experience. And when I said earlier, it was a difficult client. That didn't come out right. It's a difficult case.
Yes, it is.
He was, an amazing guy, and his passion for life was contagious. He would do anything to live longer. He was only 61, so he was young. He was still in his career. What made it difficult was he just kept going for the next thing. And at one point, that came to be a clinical trial. You can't do hospice and a clinical trial.
No.
But he was so sick. He had a hospice referral, but his doctor at the same time was trying to get him into trials. And so if there wasn't a trial, the man was going to take the hospice referral. And one did come up, and he was enrolled in that. And I think maybe it was like 2 weeks after he got accepted, he was to report to Northern Virginia. So that's two hours from where I live. And he got up there, and his hemoglobin levels were so low, they sent him home. And they said, you can come back in 2 weeks. You got to get your hemoglobin levels up. About that same day, he got this phone call that his cousin, who was one of the last living members of his family, had died. She got pancreatic cancer and died within a very short period of time. So he decided to go down to Alabama, where he was from, and be at her funeral. He's like, well, I have 2 weeks until my trial. I'm not in hospice. What am I going to do with myself? With his colon cancer, he stopped being able to pass any stool while he was there and got very sick. So he came back home and was admitted to the hospital, and they wanted to do a colostomy. He would have an ostomy bag. And so, he's still waiting for this trial. All of it was with the hope that he would return to work. He said, even if it's 6 more months, I want it. What I see as an end of life doula is delaying hospice isn't always the best choice.
Yeah, it's difficult because undoubtedly everybody's going to die. So the chances of that miracle at that phase, I'm not putting a limit on God, but the chances are slim. I know people on the other spectrum who refused any treatment at all because they believed in healing to that extreme. God will heal me. I remember a young woman from my church, she had breast cancer and chose not to have any treatment at all, and she died young. So that's kind of hard too, because in that perspective, again, they're definitely not seeking hospice. They're believing for that miracle. And that's very difficult. As a Christian, none of us are the final authority. And so I
That's right.
can't imagine what it will be like at that point of life, this kind of internal fighting in our head. And, God, does that mean I'm not trusting you if I don't try to just keep going? What do you want me to do?
What I learned after, journeying with the man with colon cancer, it wasn't a poor decision to search out a clinical trial and give it a go. He wanted to live so bad, he refused to accept that death will at some point come and to prepare for it. One of the stressful things was he had had a lawyer draft a trust, and he didn't want to put his assets in it. And he had an executor who was stressing out, frowning upon this man going to do a trial, getting the colostomy. I always sort of felt that I was failing a bit in the role of end of life doula in this particular case, because no matter what practical knowledge I brought with me, he he was not interested. Praise the Lord for his mercy. Even though the man had not wanted to take any steps in planning, things fell into place quite easily. And I even remember it was one of his last outings. We met at a coffee shop, and I took my laptop, and per his executor's request, I got some bank account numbers and passwords, and some things that we had asked him to do for 6 months probably. All of this to say, it's not there's nothing wrong with seeking curative treatment when you're at the end of your life. There's nothing wrong with looking to medicine. We're not necessarily rejecting faith because we are trusting in science and medicine. I mean, the Lord has provided wisdom and intellect in the minds of people who have the calling to medicine, right? And so God so often heals through medicine. It's okay to trust your doctor. We should also pray, ask the Lord to lead us in the decisions that we make and lead our families that are helping us, supporting us, coming to reality of that we do die, we are mortal. At some point, death will be inevitable for us individually, and being prepared for that spiritually is ultimately important. And are we comfortable in our mortality and knowing that Jesus has resurrection life and we will too? So preparing ourselves spiritually as much as practically, and none of that has to reject medicine.
I agree totally.
Yeah.
I agree. Although I would, in my personal case with the leukemia I have, they don't treat unless what happens if they treat too early. The outcomes aren't any better as if we wait and treat. Typically, although it's very very individual, so it's not like a clinical trial where you got to meet all these criteria. But in general, there's criteria that you usually meet before you have treatment. So I'm in a phase they call watch and wait. So I've been in watch and wait for 10 years now, which is awesome, right? So, I may not ever need treatment, which is what my hope and prayer for. I'm very blessed, I guess, is because
Mm.
I have many, many years probably to prepare. The people in this room, I don't think they really want to talk about preparing for end of life, which I find very interesting. And it goes back to, what is that saying? You're giving up if you talk about it, then
Well, it's one of the reasons end of life doulas are becoming more in numbers. People are training. They also would like to see that. They know the importance. As an end of life doula, I see a pattern of more difficult acceptance of death and all that comes with the end of life process if no planning is in place. I really do see that if you plan before you get sick, you seem to have a better journey of it at the end of life versus trying to make your decisions after you're already diagnosed. That's what I see. And I mean, there's always a exception. I had one end of life doula case that she had colon cancer, had been given 18 months. She was about at the 18th month mark. And she went into the hospital for a transfusion and she didn't leave. She died 10 days later. And I was hired on day one of the hospital and we got everything done. It was a team of us and we worked hard. So you can do it.
wow,
And she
wow,
had a daughter who was 10 and she was a single mom. And so her motivation was her daughter. So if there is a motivation, I mean, one thing I've been thinking about lately is, I run an end of life doula training program and I'm essentially the only Christian person doing this, that if something happened to me, I think people would want this ministry to
they
continue. And
would.
so I
Absolutely.
need to figure that out. And how do I leave this? So it goes beyond just our personal things,
Right.
like our passwords and our phones and our
Right.
bank accounts. It also goes into our legacies.
That's
And
true.
so
That's
thinking about our legacy is important.
true. I
I
agree.
I have enjoyed this
I'm sure
conversation, Georgia, and uh,
for
can't wait. Maybe we'll have you back after you finish your volunteer training and get some more time as a hospice volunteer to talk about what it's like to be a retired nurse who
that would
has taken up the end of life doula role and become a volunteer in hospice. I think there's a lot of more people out there like you than we might think that would really benefit from your experience.
well, thank you. I've enjoyed discussing all this with you. I've enjoyed it. I have.
Thank you for joining me for today's conversation on the Death and Resurrection Doula podcast. If this discussion encouraged you, I invite you to share the episode with a friend, subscribe, and visit deathandresurrectiondoula.com to learn more about our end-of-life doula training programs as well as our upcoming gatherings. Remember that Christ overcame death on the cross, and the promise of eternal life is already ours. Until next time, may the grace and peace of Jesus fill your heart with the peace that passes all understanding.